Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. I'm Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG on Twitch and YouTube, which is tagged in the description as always. Coming up tonight, Kamala Harris deploys Bill Clinton in a desperate move to win over a swing state, and 3 Israeli government departments have cut ties with the liberal media outlet Haaretz. Now, the budget announcement yesterday saw the largest increase in taxes in a single budget since 1993. And brought the tax burden to its highest percentage of GDP in UK history. Many have been quick to point fingers at Rachel Reeves over this, but she has been defending the necessity of her budget on the news round this morning.
This was an exceptional budget. This budget was to wipe the slate clean after the mismanagement and the cover-up of the previous government. I had to make big choices. I don't want to repeat a budget like this ever again, but it was necessary to get our public finances and our public services on a stable trajectory. But I'm not going to be coming back in the spring for more money. I've committed to only have annual budgets rather than the twice yearly budgets we had from the previous government to give families and businesses certainty. This was an exceptional budget at the beginning of the parliament to wipe the slate clean.
Yeah, and you said you're not going to be coming back in the spring with more tax rises, but you might be coming back this time next year with more tax rises.
As I say, this is an exceptional budget to get our public finances back on a firm footing. I will not have to do anything like this ever again.
Now, it is clear that tax rises were certainly on the cards. They had committed to raising taxes on private schools and oil and gas giants. However, there was no mention at all in the Labour manifesto of increases to capital gains tax or employer national insurance contributions. Tory MP Chris Philp certainly wasn't impressed with those announcements.
The party opposite said their plans did not require any extra tax rises. Yesterday, they announced £40 billion of extra tax rises. They said there would be no increase in national insurance. Yesterday, they announced a £25 billion increase in national insurance. The truth has finally come out. They're going to tax more, they're going to borrow more, and they're going to spend more. And now we know who's going to pay. Working people are going to pay to the tune of £19 billion a year.
Now, in the run-up to the election, Labour did say their manifesto had no plans that required additional taxation. And to my mind, they have stuck to their manifesto commitments not to raise taxes on working people specifically. After all, it is the employer who chooses to pass tax rises on to their employees. But whilst they didn't outright lie, the Labour Party was certainly not telling the whole truth, as planned cuts in unprotected departments were not accounted for in their manifesto. That dodge was dubbed a, quote, conspiracy of silence by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, due to both major parties' refusal to engage with it. If only someone had noticed this rhetorical fudge at any time before the election.
And when it comes to the Labour manifesto, there's a lot that you're not saying. What you're not saying is what you're going to do about the planned £10 billion to £20 billion worth of cuts, which were already announced in the March budget. Will they be going ahead? Will they not be going ahead? Your tax and spend plans are tiny. Now, what I think you guys are going to do, you don't want any headlines which say Labour are going to raise tax. What you're waiting to do is maybe pull some rabbits out of a hat, maybe do some reforms to capital gains, maybe you're going to fiddle around with the Bank of England rules, because lots of your plans, for example, around retaining staff in the school system or retaining staff in the NHS, that's going to cost you money. And you know that, and I know that. What the manifesto's job is to get you over the line for the election. It's not actually a plan for government. You might say it's smart politics, but it's fundamentally dishonest with the country.
That was Novara's own Ash Sarkar earlier this year, pre-election. And it's really quite funny to see just how on the nose that she was there, including the increase in capital gains tax, the changes to the fiscal rules in terms of how they calculate what is counted as debt. For example, they've changed it to only be like financial liabilities, not really being included because you make some kind of return on those. And to see Darren Jones sitting there, hearing the explicit plan. I mean, not that we know that there was definitely a plan, but it does seem as such, given what has happened since the budget. Shaking his head going, no, dishonesty with the public, never. How dare you suggest such a thing, Ms. Sarkar? When really, actually, this was the case. We saw all of these things came to bear. They provided this threadbare manifesto with a lot of things that were easy to sell to the public, and then, shock horror, everything is way worse than we thought, we're going to have to raise taxes. And sure, I think that these things were absolutely necessary. It was necessary, but we knew We absolutely knew that it was going to be an £18 billion shortfall in certain unprotected departments. Stephen Flynn mentioned it a lot during the election debates, yet Labour refused to engage with this question. And that is where the dishonesty really does lie, rather than in whether or not national insurance employer contributions count as a tax on working people or not. Whilst the fearless journalists here at Novara Media were busy holding Labour to account before the election, the mainstream media were treating them with kid gloves. Now, apparently, they've all noticed the dishonesty that was being peddled pre-election. This was Beth Rigby interviewing Rachel Reeves last night.
You've made choices about massive increases in public spending. You've made choices to settle the public, say, pet sector pay deal. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's full fat on tax and spend. It seems to me like, are you at half fat or are you just being dishonest?
Well, no one's ever compared me to Jeremy Corbyn before. I stood down from his shadow cabinet because I disagreed with everything that he was doing. But if you're faced with a situation where there's a £22 billion black hole in the public finances, you can either sweep that under the carpet or you can be open and transparent and honest with people about the situation you find yourself in.
40 billion of tax rises and 70 billion in spending.
And we have published today,
spending and borrowing.
And we've published today a line-by-line account of the £22 billion.
Do you understand what I'm trying to get at here, which is the public will look at this manifesto, they voted for you, they come out 4 months later, and there is a massive tax rising and massive spending budget from Labour. Do you understand why they might feel cheated by you, that you did not level with them about what the public finances might look after the election? There was a conspiracy of silence. Everyone was talking about the public finances not adding up.
Now, Rachel Reeves is lying here. She was never a member of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, so she would not have been able to have stepped down like she said she did. Although, given the much vaunted changed Labour Party that won this year's election, comparisons to the previous Labour leadership are of course inevitable. So, who better to dissect the budget with than the man himself, former Labour leader and now independent MP for Islington North? I spoke to Jeremy today, and I began by asking him whether this felt like a Labour budget.
Not really. It felt like a management budget with some useful bits in it, such as the miners' pension compensation and something about business rates for smaller businesses. But the deficiencies in the budget are quite large, and I would put them in the ways of poverty and inequality and not really addressed in this budget. They had the chance to raise the threshold for paying tax up to, say, 15,000, which would have made a big difference to the very poorest and lowest paid workers. They didn't do that. And by no longer linking the threshold with inflation, in effect, that means that the taxation rate will go up for everybody, but obviously that has the biggest effect on the poorest people. The other areas that I'm concerned about are that of benefits and disability. 58% of the poorest households in the country have somebody in them with disabilities, and that is often brought about because of the way in which they've inherited and carried on the Tory policies on sanctions and disability benefits. And so I felt at the end of it sort of disappointed because there wasn't as much in it as there could and should have been, but it didn't tackle the fundamental issue, which is the growth of inequality in Britain. And to do that, you have to do a number of things, like a wealth tax would be a good start for those with assets of over 10 million, and a new top rate of taxation, and increasing corporate taxation to a realistic level. At the moment, Britain is still sort of parading itself as the a place that wants to be the lowest tax rates in the G7. Well, that is really not a good place to be. They need to look at the issues facing the country as a whole. Unclear what the local government spending settlement is going to be, and there's been no separate or special announcement on this yet. And local government spending is a key element to all of our lives. Likewise, on NHS, yes, more money into the NHS is good, of course, but they have to address the fundamental issue of the NHS, and that is the creation of the internal market and the almost automatic privatisation of services from the Health and Social Care Act, which finally reached the statute book in 2012, which has been so damaging to all of our hospitals. So there are issues there that have to be looked at. And then lastly, the poverty created by the two-child benefit cap is enormous. I see the food banks in my own area, and it is the parents and carers of the largest families that are accessing the food banks because they're absolutely desperate to get some food. And the removal of the winter fuel payment to any pensioner with an income of more than 10,500 is unnecessary and cruel. We've been through a period where there's been big demands to try and redress the imbalance of the past 15 years on wages, and that's where the strikes took place in education, in the postal services, and in the railways. But even though strikes that were the most successful barely caught up with the loss of income over the past 15 years, what the budget needs to address is the fundamental inequalities of our society, the housing inequalities, the income inequalities, which are often related. And just think about this. If we don't invest in the housing needs of the entirety of the population, does a child in a large family, 3 or 4 children, growing up in a small 2-bedroom flat, actually have the same life chances as a child growing up in a decent-sized accommodation, house with a garden, and so on? I think we all know the answer to that. If we're to give all of our kids a decent chance for the future, then it's crucially housing costs and housing supply issues that have got to be addressed.
So you mentioned just then that Labour are not introducing a wealth tax in this budget. Now, of course, many people on the left have been calling for a wealth tax. What do you think Labour are so scared of?
I think they're frightened of what the media will say about it, just using the words wealth tax. I mean, you could call it something different if they're upset about that. You could say an increased rate of taxation on large assets, same thing. There's lots of things you could do to rename it. But I think they are shying away from it because they are frightened of what the media would say about it, or maybe they just simply do not want to do it. But they cannot escape these massive levels of inequality that exist in this country. They've got wider and worse over the past 15 years, ever since austerity kicked in 2010, and they got massively wider during and since COVID. And they are not really addressing that. And that, to me, is a big failing. Raising the living wage is good, of course, but what they haven't addressed is the issue of the biggest cost that low-income families face is the proportion of their income they're forced to spend on housing. Unless they're in a seriously controlled rent, such as council housing or most of housing association properties, then they are victims of the vagaries of the private rented sector. There's not many people who are on minimum wage or London living wage or any kind of living wage are likely to be owner-occupiers. They're more likely to be in the private rented sector. And whilst I support the Renters' Rights Bill in the sense it ends no-fault eviction, which is a good thing to end, it doesn't actually relate to the fundamental issue, which is the excessive level of rents. And because the rents are so high, obviously people have to scrimp and save on everything else. And it also means that those people who are in the private rented sector, particularly young people who might have actually relatively good jobs, simply can't save anything because they're spending so much on rent.
Now, much was vaunted in the run-up to the budget about it being a budget for working people. Now, of course, as you mentioned before, there's a very large section of society who cannot work due to disability. And of course, they are carrying forward the Tory welfare reforms to the work capability assessment, which could leave 450,000 people with reductions in their benefits. What calculation do you think Labour are making here?
I think the calculation they're making is that they're hoping it won't be noticed. And indeed, when I was doing an LBC discussion last night about the budget, I brought up the question of disability and the poverty that relates to disability. And the three fellow guests on the panel sort of looked at me like, wow, didn't know about that or hadn't thought about that side of it. So I guess that's what they're hoping. But actually, it's actually quite cynical. We have a disability system that is full of penalties for people who are often going through a very, very hard time. The reductions in benefits, the sanctioning of people, the work capability assessments are actually really, really damaging. And so when they say it's a budget for working people and to enable all people to work, I'm not really sure it is, because it doesn't deal with those fundamental questions. And I think that is a big gap in it. Look at the statements made by DPAC, Disabled People Against the Cuts, yesterday on the budget. They're excoriating about the budget, and rightly so.
Let's talk about defence. Now, Rachel Reeves says that they are looking towards increasing the percentage of GDP that is spent on defence up to 2.5% by the end of the Parliament, which includes an extra £3 billion per year for Ukraine for, quote unquote, as long as it takes. Is this what workers want their tax money spent on? And if not, who does it really serve?
It's interesting that it's the one area of government spending that seems to be subject to no debate whatsoever. The increase in the Ministry of Defence budget to 2.5% of GDP is a massive increase. We're on around, well, actually less than 2% at the moment. And that increase on current form is at least 30 billion a year. Increase before the end of this decade. So in other words, in just over 5 years' time, defence spending will be 30 billion more at today's prices. By then, obviously, there'll be some degree of inflation, so there'll be more. And that includes, as you said, a huge amount every year to the Ukraine, and it also includes the redevelopment of the nuclear missile system, as well as the development of a much greater global role in defence for Britain. So it seems that this is an area where NATO requirements are sacrosanct and cannot be factored in to a budget. So we have a restriction on the amount of money going into new housing. We have 2% savings required on all other public services, including housing, through alleged efficiency. We have no such requirement on the Ministry of Defence or an arms expenditure. And so you start after looking at the foreign policy objectives that are within this. And I think that's why we need to promote a much stronger and greater discussion about the longer term global role for this country. We're 65 million people on the northwest coast of Europe, and we are spending one of the largest proportions of GDP in the world on defence, certainly the highest in Europe and likely to increase. And the return to a sort of post-war global role for Britain era, which even Harold Wilson said should end in the 1960s. So we're back into a global role through the AUKUS Pact, which is the pact with Australia, and the promotion of the Cold War with China. Surely we need to be doing something a bit different, like being a voice for peace in the world, a voice for international law in the world, rather than conflict. There are massive wars going on currently in the Ukraine. Russia is wrong to invade, yes. There has to be a diplomatic way out of it. There has to be an initiative taken by somebody. I suspect the next peace initiative will come from Latin America, Africa, and possibly the Vatican to try and bring about some movement there. Likewise, the war of Israel's bombardment of Gaza, increasingly now of the West Bank, also of southern Lebanon, right into bombing of Beirut, and already quite serious exchange of fire with Iran. We are providing weapons and the conduit for weapons for Israel, and allowing Israel's own defense manufacturing to take place in this country, all of which is now wrong, on the wrong side of the views of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. So if we believe in international law, as the government claims it does, then that should apply in this conflict as well. This huge defense expenditure does nothing to improve social conditions in this country or indeed anywhere else. And it is money that could be spent either on services or on environment or overseas aid. It could be spent on a lot of things, but it isn't. It's being spent on weapons. And the main driver for this is the arms industry, which is why I've been involved now in promoting our new book from the Peace and Justice Project, The Monstrous Anger of the Guns, which describes the effectiveness of the arms industry all around the world in lobbying for and getting the policies they want, all of which require huge levels of expenditure on weapons.
With regards to the budget, were there any pleasant surprises for you that you weren't expecting?
The one that I was pleased about was the miners' pension settlement. It's an issue that has been disgracefully around for a long time. The appalling treatment of the former mining communities by the Thatcher government, the failure of the Blair government to properly resolve all of that. I remember discussing this with Ian Lavery, miners MP, in 2015. We included it in our programme immediately and in the manifestos of 2017 and 2019. And if at last that means security and justice for what are now often quite elderly retired miners, then that is a good thing.
According to Rachel Reeves, the IMF, the IFS, and other economics experts, large-scale public investment is now the way to go. Given that a lot of the National Wealth Fund policy is stuff that is kind of lifted from the National Infrastructure Bank policy and the National Investment Bank policy from the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, does this feel like a vindication of all the policies that you put forward to the country in those elections? Or does it sting a bit that you're not getting the credit for policies that you really spearheaded in that era?
Well, I'm not bothered about the credit one way or the other. That's not the issue. The issue is having a National Wealth Fund and a National Investment Bank. I was very keen on that to being the centrality of our economic strategy, as John McDonnell articulated so well, the need for it. Just be slightly cautious. There is quite a big private sector involvement in all of this.
That was me speaking to Jeremy Corbyn earlier today. Now, for those of us on the left of British politics who've been served a Section 21 notice by the Labour Party, the Green Party is increasingly looking like a brand new home. They've promoted progressive economic policies, have made serious proposals on housing, and they take the climate catastrophe seriously. This week we've seen devastating flash floods across eastern and southern Spain. Over 150 people are dead and dozens more are missing. And climate scientists have already linked this event to global warming. Dr. Friederike Otto is the head of the World Weather Attribution Project at Imperial College. No doubt about it, these explosive downpours were intensified by climate change. With every fraction of a degree of fossil fuel warming, the atmosphere can hold more moisture, leading to heavier bursts of rainfall. These deadly floods are yet another reminder of how dangerous climate change has already become at just 1.3 degrees C of global warming. Early today, I was joined by Green Party Deputy Leader Zack Polanski. In the context of extreme weather events currently taking place in Spain, I began by asking him whether he thinks Labour's budget is fit for purpose.
I mean, I think the first thing to look at is in this budget, was climate or nature explicitly mentioned? Not at all. And that takes a completely different meaning of the word or phrase, net zero. This budget was not for purpose. And the problem is not the budget itself. The problem is the entire Labour Party or this Labour government. This entire obsession with growth, as opposed to an obsession with happiness, health, well-being, communities live with purpose. This budget was a huge missed opportunity. Now, you always say this phrase that you've got to be fair to the Labour government, and I do think there's a truth to that. I think you have to acknowledge when they're in the right direction. So more money for the National Health Service. No one is going to argue with that. But first of all, it's not enough money because essentially that's just kind of allowing the service to continue as it is. And I don't know if anyone's used any of the National Health Service services recently, but it is not in a good way. So that needed much more investment. But also, it's much more about this real shift away from public sector funding to private capital. We know that money for the National Health Service, a lot of it will be going to private companies. So to answer the question, is it fit for purpose? Absolutely not, because this was a huge missed opportunity to transform our economy. How would the Green Party budget been different? Well, we would have scrapped the two-child benefit cap. Obviously, we wouldn't have had the disaster over winter fuel payments. But one of the big things we would have done was implement a wealth tax, a 1% tax of assets of £10 million or more that could be raising money that could go straight back into our public services. Now, of course, that's not the only way you can fund money for public services, and there's lots of other ways around money creation. But what we really need to tackle is that huge inequality in our society. And it just seems like the Labour Party are really there to protect their vested interests and corporate donors, and not essentially our communities and people.
Yeah, I remember Adrian Ramsey during the election period asked about whether or not we should be prioritising growth, describing GDP as a blunt instrument rather than more holistic ways in which we could describe the health of our economy. And I think I would agree with you there. Now, one of the other measures that we've seen announced in the budget is the freezing of fuel duty, which is obviously going to cost a lot of money if it wasn't being frozen. And instead, they're going to be raising the bus fare cap, therefore pinching money from public transport users to subsidise motorists. What do you make of this?
I mean, you couldn't make it up. And what it really reminds me of is when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, and he asked a question at one point to the Prime Minister. He had the temerity to ask a question about buses. And I remember a lot of the media or establishment class kind of mocking the question as if this was like a small issue compared to the big issues people should really care about. Buses really matter to people. Now, this often gets said as buses matter in rural places, but let me start with where I'm elected, in London. Now, I live in central London. I can cycle, I can walk, I'm fine. But if you get to zones 3, 4, 5, certainly if you get to the outside zones, these buses are an absolute lifeline. And also, if your principal goal is growth, which I don't think it should be, but if it is, that's a terrible idea for growth. It means people can't get to training, they can't get to work. So that's a terrible way of powering an economy. And if you step outside of London and go to any of the other cities in our country, the public transport gets even worse. And then, of course, we get to those rural places. And sometimes there is one bus route a day, if you're lucky, or no bus route at all. Now, that's terrible for people who need to use buses. It's terrible for working class people who can't afford more expensive transport, or anyone who can't afford more expensive transport. And it's terrible for the environment at the exact moment we should be shifting and encouraging people to take public transport. There's often a misconception that people think if you're a Green Party member, you have to not drive. That's completely impossible. There's lots of places where there's absolute car dependency. And what we're really about is saying, let's make sure that the cheapest, greenest, the most convenient option is always the one that is pushed and incentivized by government. It seems like this Labour government are determined to do the entire opposite and ultimately make sure that car driving is cheaper and public transport is more expensive. That's a completely topsy-turvy way. It's a very bold move at the same time that we're seeing those awful flood events in Spain, as well as the constant climate disasters across the global south. This is a moment where we do not have time to mess around with this. We've got to mitigate our emissions. We've got to make things we've got to change things urgently. And just the idea we would have a new Labour government who say that they're a changed Labour Party, a changed government, and they are not willing to tackle the climate crisis. They're not willing to give the economic transformation to this country it needs. And they're not willing to stand up for marginalised and underrepresented groups. This is pretty disastrous. So when I say this budget's a missed opportunity, that might be letting them off lightly.
One of the big announcements in the budget was the changing of the fiscal rules to allow for more public investment. Now, one of the Green Party's big pitches to voters at the election was around £90 billion each year of capital spending. Now, does this mean that the Green Party have won the argument on public investment, on borrowing to invest?
I wish we'd won the argument, because it's not like the Labour Party are proudly speaking about why this is important. It feels like they were fundamentally dishonest about it during the election and now are trying to kind of sneak it in there. Now, let me be very clear. I'm glad they've changed those fiscal rules. So again, coming back to acknowledging when people get things right, it is right to change these rules. I still think some of the rules they've created now are still ridiculous. In fact, it's absurd we're even having a conversation about fiscal rules, because I think it's been shown what a complete fiction this is by the fact we've had this budget. In fact, I saw a graph just a couple of days ago that showed the average lifeline of fiscal rules. And in the UK, I think it's on average 3 to 5 years before we reinvent new ones. So the fact the government have tied themselves in knots for imaginary rules is completely nonsensical. And by the way, dishonesty is not something that should be a surprise for this Labour Party. We saw Keir Starmer run on a whole set of pledges running on the coattails of Jeremy Corbyn. And then as soon as he was elected Labour leader, he's pretty much ditched every single one of them. So we know there is a fundamental dishonesty to how senior members of this government operate. But to answer the question more directly, I don't think we've won the argument, but I think we're winning the argument. I think it's really vital we continue to keep up this conversation. And the really important conversation is that when we invest, when you borrow to invest or create money to invest, what you're essentially doing there is powering the economy. This is the most basic economics, which says if you are going to protect public spending, in inverted commas, or cut it by 2%, as Rachel Reeves said she's going to, that is disastrous. That's David Cameron, George Osborne. I don't see a real difference. They came in saying we've got this awful economic picture. We need to make some difficult choices, so we're going to slash public services. We saw what that did for our economy, and more importantly, we saw what that did for people's lives, particularly people who are disabled or having more difficult circumstances for whatever reason. This cannot be allowed to go unchallenged. And ultimately, this is a return to austerity. And just because the Labour Party say this isn't austerity, well, frankly, I can't find any other words than we're back to a fundamental dishonesty we were just talking about. It's really important that journalists in particular hold this government to account, because this country cannot take another year, let alone another few years of more austerity.
Now, whilst the budget made some provisions for house building, it only had enough state investment for around 5,000 social homes, which is only 0.3% of Labour's 1.5 million house building pledge. Is this enough to solve the housing crisis? And what would the Greens do differently?
It's definitely not enough to solve the housing crisis. Now, because I've been very down on the Labour Party during this interview, I should say the fact we're talking about social or even council housing feels like that is, again, a step in the right direction. And for too long, this conversation about housing has been so binary. It's just been, do you have houses or do you not have houses? What we really need to be having the conversation is about the types of homes we're having. So we need to make sure that we are creating lots and lots of council homes. There are 1 million households on the waiting list. And, it's just absolutely absurd that people in 2024 do not have a home to go to. But if your solution is to go to private capital and build extremely unaffordable luxury apartments that private developers love building, then that is clearly not going to solve the housing crisis. And by the way, those same property developers are the same property developers who donate to the Conservative Party and to the Labour Party. So when you hear them making these cases about the housing crisis, I think it's always important who funds you, runs you. And it's really important for people to acknowledge that if the Labour Party are making attacks on the Green Party about the housing crisis, they are speaking with the voice of the property developers. What would the Green Party do differently? Well, we'd be looking to the public sector to have this huge transformation in making sure, as well as bringing empty homes back into use, we are building council homes. That really, really needs to happen, but they need to be the right types of homes, as I've said. And also, we're building homes right now that will need to be retrofitted, just meaning insulated or brought up to standards for the environment in just a few years. That, again, is absurd. Build the homes properly now. And that's a whole industry waiting to happen, where we could be making sure people are in good jobs, where they're being paid properly, they're in a trade union, they've got dignity at work. This is the way to transform our economy, as well as a proper industrial strategy. Things like nationalising steel, making sure that those vital things that we need in our economy are in the public sector. This transformation, both around housing and around the future of the green economic transformation, are all there and waiting to happen, but the Labour Party just seem to be refusing to grasp them.
I'm joined now by Moya Lothian-McLean. It seems a little bit surreal to be the other side of the camera from you, Moya, but it's lovely to be joined with you once again. Now, we have just had two different perspectives on the budget from Jeremy Corbyn and Zack Polanski. What were your key takeaways from those interviews?
I think the overarching theme between those two interviews, apart from, they're critiquing it from a left-wing perspective, I'd say, and a Green perspective particularly, is that they've highlighted this problem that the Labour Party has put themselves in, which is that they're having to be dishonest. They have trapped themselves by not being totally forthcoming with, what adhering to their fiscal rules actually will mean for the general public. And they're in this position because they're not, as I think Jeremy pointed out, they're not brave enough to do things like a wealth tax. They don't have the courage to do that. They think that they have to adhere to these fiscal rules, which they've tweaked a little bit, but they're not actually doing anything radical with them, or they're not doing anything that really meets the scale of the challenge that they have been set. Instead, they're sort of walking this tightrope. And it means that, they're having to fudge all this language about working people. They're like being dishonest about the level of tax rises or the tax burden that we put on different people. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Putting taxes up to pay for public spending is not necessarily a bad thing at all. And I think the budget was making moves in the right direction. They identified certain areas that definitely need investment. This idea of like, we're going to change what debt means to make sure that public investment isn't linked to it in the same way. All these things showed the intention, but because they're too scared to actually go through with that, because they're too scared to make the changes that would really be needed to properly invest in the country long term, what's happening instead is they're sort of hedging the bets now, and they're saying, well, we'll front load by that. We'll front load and we'll throw this money in now, and we'll say, okay, well, there's going to be 500 million to deal with these potholes, and you'll get 19% uplift in this budget. But when you actually look at what's happening, all the money that they've managed to free up is going, it's being parceled out for like the next year, and then the day-to-day spending, the stuff that really affects how people experience the infrastructure in the country around them and their day-to-day lives, that is going to be incredibly tight. It's going up by like 1.3, and the money that they've got now is only there to fill gaps. It's to fill the gaps that already left. So in like 2025, 26, when it comes to looking at spending again, and you need all this extra money that should be there, and they haven't actually got it because of the fiscal rules that they've said they have to adhere to, and maybe growth hasn't gone up as much as they claimed it would go up, and the little tweaks and changes that they made have now only gone so far. Then they're stuck, and then they're like, well, we're going to cut this and we're going to go back to austerity, or we're going to have to put in like a more austere public spending. There'll be cuts to public spending. It's because they are trying to walk this tightrope, and you can't walk a tightrope. You can't walk a tightrope, and you can't bind yourself into a corner like the old, not to repurpose the old quote in such a bastardized fashion, but the master's tools will never dismantle the house. The fiscal rules will never rebuild Britain. And they are locked into these fiscal rules now for, I think it was Zach who pointed out, for like the next 3 to 5 years. And they've trapped themselves in this position. I hope they can get out, but I doubt it.
I think you're right there. And I think what's important too is that I don't think whilst the dishonesty is bad and the public will dislike them if they are being dishonest to them, at the end of the day, the single thing that will allow Labour to potentially win a second election to get a second term at the end of this parliament, the fulcrum on which that lies is, do living standards go up or not? And if living standards don't go up, they'll get booted out straight away. So they need to be crafting policies that are definitely going to achieve that aim, regardless of whether that involves manifesto pledges being broken or not. The issue, of course, is the more you constrain yourself with fiscals, I think you're right, that won't actually get them a lot of these things that they need to get to be politically popular and relevant. So yeah, absolutely agree with that. Israel's war on Gaza continues to be a major sticking point in the Democrats' fight for the White House, and it's being perhaps hardest felt in the upper Midwest state of Michigan. Home to the US's largest Arab population, it's also an important swing state, one that Donald Trump surprised everyone by winning in 2016. Until then, Michigan had been won by Democratic nominees in every single presidential election since 1988. In 2020, Joe Biden took it back, beating Trump's 2016 result by 3 points. But in this election, it's on a knife edge, with no clear frontrunner so far. So, if you're a Democrat campaign manager fighting to win a key battleground state, who would you send out to stomp for Kamala Harris in a state that resoundingly rejected Hillary Clinton in 2016? I know! How about her husband? This was Bill Clinton explaining the subtleties of genocide to potential Democrat voters.
I understand why young Palestinian and Arab Americans in Michigan think too many people have died. I get that. But if you lived in one of those kibbutzim in Israel, right next to Gaza, where the people there were the most pro-friendship with Palestine, most pro-two-state solution of any of the Israeli communities, were the ones right next to Gaza. And Hamas butchered them. And so then the people who criticize it are essentially saying, yeah, but look how many people you've killed in Ritalin. So how many is enough for you to kill to punish them for the terrible things they did? That all sounds nice until you realize What would you do if it was your family and you hadn't done anything but support a homeland for the Palestinians, and one day they come for you and slaughter the people in your village? You would say, well, you'll have to forgive me. I'm not keeping score that way.
So let's get this straight. According to Bill Clinton, we're supposed to understand and even empathize with the idea that the killing of hundreds of Israeli civilians on October the 7th therefore justifies the killing of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians in response. Not to mention the wounding and maiming of more than 100,000 more, as well as the displacement of 2 million people. And yet, we're never supposed to understand the thought that being imprisoned in an Israeli-occupied territories, deprived of opportunities and freedoms, and witnessing the regular killing of members of your community might lead to violence. It doesn't make sense. And as long as Western politicians continue to push the idea that some rage is righteous while other rage is blind, they'll be rightly punished by voters. But that wasn't enough for Clinton. He went on to rehash his own failed attempt to secure a two-state solution in the region.
Look, I worked on this hard. And the only time Yasser Arafat didn't tell me the truth was when he promised me he was going to accept the peace deal that we had worked out, which would have given the Palestinians a state on 96% of the West Bank and 4% of Israel, and they got to choose where the 4% of Israel was. So they would have the effect of the same land of all the West Bank. They would have a capital in East Jerusalem. They would have I can hardly talk about this. And they would have equal access all day, every day, to the security towers that Israel maintained all through the West Bank up to the Golden Heights. All this was offered, including, I will say it again, a capital in East Jerusalem and 2 of the 4 quadrants of the old city of Jerusalem, confirmed by the Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and his cabinet. And they said no.
Now, that's a partial and simplified retelling of history, and it contains the premise that, for failing to accept a deal that wasn't in their interests, the Palestinians have no one to blame but themselves for all that's come afterwards. Altogether, Clinton seems to be saying that the Palestinians should have taken whatever they were offered by Israel and the West 25 years ago, and they should take the violence Israel is dishing out to them right now. Not exactly a message that's going to convince pro-Palestinian voters that the Democrats are on the side of ending Israel's genocide, especially when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have been insistent that they're doing everything that they can do to secure a ceasefire. Compare that take to this one, given by Bernie Sanders a few days ago.
I understand that there are millions of Americans who disagree with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris on the terrible war in Gaza. I am one of them. While Israel had a right to defend itself against the horrific Hamas terrorist attack of October 7th, which killed 1,200 innocent people and took 250 hostages, it did not have the right to wage an all-out war against the entire Palestinian people. It did not have the right to kill 42,000 Palestinians, 2/3 of whom were children, women, and the elderly, or injure over 100,000 people in Gaza. It did not have the right to destroy Gaza's infrastructure, housing, and healthcare system. It did not have the right to bomb every one of Gaza's 12 universities. It did not have the right to block humanitarian aid, causing massive malnutrition in children and, in fact, starvation. And that is why I am doing everything I can to block U.S. military aid and offensive weapons sales to the right-wing extremist Netanyahu government in Israel.
Now, whatever you personally think about lesser evil voting or tactical voting, whatever you want to call it, i.e. voting for the Democratic Party despite their actions in supplying the arms to Israel for them to wage their war in Gaza and indeed in the West Bank, regardless of how you feel, but whether or not you think you should vote for them to beat Donald Trump and the Republican Party, taking it as if you saw someone who does believe that, Or who do you think is more likely to convince people who don't want to vote for the Democrats because of the war in Gaza out of those two particular pitches, right? One person, in Bill Clinton's case, saying, well, actually, this is just unfortunate what happens to these people and you should just vote anyway, and regardless of the consequences, we should continue to arm them. It's the Palestinians' fault. Let's just leave it there, but you have to vote to get Trump out because he's the orange man bad. And then you compare that in a complete juxtaposition to Bernie Sanders saying, look, whatever you think about this, I agree with these things, and there are different factions within the party who are trying different things. I mean, look at what happens during the uncommitted vote during the kind of protracted primary season. There wasn't really a primary season. There was a concerted effort by people within the Democratic Party to try and get the leadership to change their position on the war in Gaza within the party. Bernie Sanders says there he's trying to do everything he can to stop offensive weapon sales to the Netanyahu government as well, and has roundly condemned all of the different war crimes that he spoke of there, committed by the Netanyahu government, committed by the IDF in Gaza. That is something that is empathetic to the concerns of pro-Palestinian voters, some of whom will not vote for the Democrats because of this issue, some of those who will hold their nose. And the job of convincing those types is what every Democratic Party politician will be wanting to do in the run-up to the election. And you compare it to Bill Clinton, it makes no sense that they would kind of trot his views out very specifically to try and win voters over. It doesn't make any sense to me whatsoever if you just think of it from a Democratic Party perspective at the very least. Now, Bill Clinton's views on Palestine aren't the only reason Kamala Harris made a mistake in getting him to campaign for her. One of Harris's major electoral platforms is how bad Donald Trump would be for women. And given Bill Clinton's history with women, putting him front and center kind of undermines that message. But also, for many US voters still on the fence, a vote for Trump is a vote against business as usual, a vote against political dynasties and cozy Washington insiders. And the Clintons are the most paradigmatic example of exactly that. It's the kind of mistake that raises questions about Harris's political judgment. It's also the kind of mistake that she really can't afford to make. In the national polls, Harris retains a slight lead over Trump, well within the margin of error. But the trajectory is on Trump's side, with Harris having lost support of the last month as Trump's popularity has slowly grown. In the 7 swing states that are likely to decide the election, Trump has a stronger lead in Arizona and Georgia, and a slight lead in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. Harris is slightly ahead in Michigan, but Nevada and Wisconsin remain anybody's guess. But there's another indicator that tells a different story. If we look at the bookies, for example. Averaging the odds being offered by major bookies gives Trump a 62% probability of winning, as compared to Harris's 41%. And that's a very dramatic shift on how things looked just weeks ago. Moya, do these Trump gains reveal a Harris campaign losing its initial momentum?
Well, I'm not in America, so I don't know. This is the tightest election race that's been fought, I think, for years, isn't it? It's it's definitely concerning. I think the problem is like we've been talking about on this show and anywhere else left-leaning has discussed the US election. The Democrats are rehashing the same old campaign strategies that only just held on in 2020. They had a chance to go away, like really reevaluate what that party is about, what it stands for, and the pitch that it was making to voters, and why voters would shift to Donald Trump in the first place, why that backing was there, given that it's got only steadily more extremes since he first decided to run for president in 2016. And instead of coming up with conclusions that I think actually matched what voters were saying or the message they were getting, they thought, no, it's the kids who are wrong. There's this image of the kind of either the radical lefty who won't vote for Kamala because of the genocide, or the really rabid right-wing evangelical type who's voting for Trump, and that's not really what's going on. Like with the polls and the lost momentum, what's fascinating as well is that Kamala is losing momentum among camps where they can't really explain what's going on. So, for example, Black and Hispanic men voters. There's a real mix of factors that different policy wonks have tried to understand. And don't get me wrong, like still the majority of Black and Hispanic voters, both men and women, are saying they intend to vote for the Democrats, but there's enough who are peeling off and say they're going to back Trump. And it's not to project Brexit on everything, but there's interesting things when you look at sort of, like 43, I think, % of Hispanic voters say that they support building a wall, and 41% of Black voters say they support building a wall. And there's similar rates of Hispanic and Black voters who say that they want cracking down on undocumented migrants, groups that, sometimes that they have disproportionately belonged to, but also that they are parceled into in the minds of politicians. So, and you saw a similar thing in the UK where you saw people of both first and second migrant families, generation migrant families, who were like, yeah, we should definitely tighten the asylum rules. There's too many people coming here, and would say all these buzzwords about illegal migration. It was really, really fascinating how this scarcity mindset, once you get in, you want to keep everyone else who's a bit like you out, which I think is fascinating. But yeah, it's like you say, these margins are really tight. So it's not like the majority of these voters are not voting for Kamala, but enough of them are peeling off to Trump for these various reasons that it will make a difference unless she finds a way to pull them back. And so far, the ways that we've seen the Democratic campaign try and pull some of these voters back, such as, the crazy cringy ads about marijuana and crypto that are aimed at black male voters, bit odd, bit odd. I'm not to say whether those are actually effective or not, because I haven't seen the stats, but just sitting here, they felt very weird and jarring. But then also they ran these ads recently that were criticized heavily online about women who voted for Kamala, the Democratic ticket, Tim Walz and Kamala, and they're looking over and they're secretly voting while their husband's a Republican, and those got really heavily criticized. But if you listen to what grassroots campaigners are saying, there is a big problem with women who feel like they do have to adhere to what their husband's voting intention is, and often that's right wing. That is actually something that's happening in the US. It's not pretty. It's not like a nice thing to talk about, but it's something that if you talk to the campaigners, they are saying is happening. So there's all these different strategies they're trying to appeal to these groups that are peeling off, and some of them seem more effective than others. But yeah, it's like the votes in somewhere like Michigan that they might have lost, that might have made a difference. I think like the 31% of people who say that the genocide in Gaza is going to impact their vote, those were lost weeks ago. Those are not coming back. You've got Muslim leaders calling Trump in Michigan, Trump the peace candidate, which is rubbish. It's bollocks. Trump, if you look at Trump's policy, like what he will wreak in the Middle East, it's like, we're like, well, it can't get worse. I feel like under Trump, it could get worse. What's worse than a genocide? I feel like Trump can turn that genocide dial up, but he has stayed mostly quite quiet. He has benefited from not being in power, and he's stayed quiet apart from saying things like, I'm the best friend Israel will ever have, and the statements he's made previously about wanting to ban Palestinian refugees, etc. So he can present himself as the candidate who will somehow be an ally when, on every occasion, like Kamala and her Democratic elite alliances have just managed to belittle the genocide and belittle the concerns of voters who say this is really important to us. So she's fluffed it on every single occasion where she could have actually shown a backbone, and Trump has exploited that.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying that people aren't really scrutinizing Trump's foreign policy history enough, especially considering he was the guy who assassinated Qasem Soleimani, or was the president when that happened. And of course, he sold out the Kurds in Rojava to Erdogan as well. So a real Hobson's choice going into the selection, unfortunately, or catch-22 rather. Haaretz is Israel's largest liberal newspaper, and it's now found itself in the crosshairs of the Israeli government. That's after the newspaper's publisher, Amos Shokin, made these remarks at a conference in London.
The Netanyahu government doesn't care about imposing a cruel apartheid regime on the Palestinian population. It dismisses the costs of both sides for defending the settlements while fighting the Palestinian freedom fighter that Israel calls terrorists.
In that speech, Shokin also referred to Israel's actions in Gaza as a second Nakba, and he called for international sanctions against the country. But it was his use of the phrase freedom fighters to describe Hamas that has enraged the Israeli government. Israeli newspapers rely significantly on revenue from advertising space bought up by the state, and journalists need access to politicians to do their jobs. But now, 3 government departments, the Education, Interior, and Diaspora Affairs departments, have all cut ties with the newspaper. Meanwhile, Israel's communications minister has called for a general boycott of Haaretz, saying this: It is worth noting that Haaretz is generously funded by Israeli citizens through advertisements and subscriptions purchased by the government. Halting the purchase of services from Haaretz by government bodies will ease the significant distress Israeli citizens feel, not only from the newspaper's publications, but also from being compelled to fund it with their tax money. This approach will mitigate the harm to Israeli citizens without disproportionately infringing on freedom of expression. It is interesting that the minister talks about Haaretz's publications causing distress for the Israeli public. But for what? Reporting the news? It's almost as though shock and speech provided just the excuse the minister was looking for, and the proposed general boycott, as well as the actual cutting of ties to the paper by 3 government departments, takes place against the backdrop of Israel's shuttering Al Jazeera's offices in the occupied West Bank last month, after also accusing several of their journalists of being terrorists too. The government didn't much like that outlet's reporting either. Moya, does this look like the only democracy in the Middle East to you?
I mean, the mask is entirely off with the administration of Israel, and I guess the thing is with this, it's, you know, there is no intervention and no recognition of what's going on in Israel in any real way from sort of the Western powers. There's still, that's why it feels so odd. We're looking at, you know, them banning like the refugee agency UNRWA. We're looking at them, say, you know, banning Al Jazeera. We're watching a crackdown on the freedom of press. We're watching like constant lies, all of this obviously alongside a genocide. We're watching just a constant warping of the truth, a funhouse mirror of the truth. And yet what makes it so morally injurious to see this is the absolute denial from the part of like Western leaders and Western countries interacting with Israel that it's behaving in a way that is at all egregious, that, you know, the internal freedoms within Israel are at all radicalized. What you're looking at is a state that is completely radicalized to the nth degree. It has become so genocidal. It has managed also to radicalize the population to support these measures out of this, you know, fear, out of the weaponization of victimhood, as I think Naomi Klein puts. I'm paraphrasing, but if you read Doppelganger, it's just such a good articulation of how re-traumatizing a populace again and again and again through fear and presenting, you know, this idea of like, you are constantly the victims, you're constantly under threat, so you must eradicate all those who threaten you. How that has managed to get them to this position of just like frothing at the bit to see all normal civil liberties and all normal institutions that you would find in a democracy just shut down, whether that's, you know, the free press, whether that's a court that actually behaves in a way that's separate from like a judiciary that's separate from the government executive, all of these different institutions that you find in a working democracy. Israel hasn't been a democracy for a very long time, but that has ramped up to a degree that it's almost rabid in the fascism, the way that this state is run now. And to see Haaretz, which is, you know, it's a liberal paper. It's a paper that has pushed back at times on the genocide, but nowhere, like, it's also run articles co-signing it. It's a paper that exists within the context of the society that it's produced by. And to see that now threatened in this manner just tells you how far gone the norm is in Israel, what the norm now is, and how far away it is from the norm, you know, even 2 years ago, which in some ways is a breaking of the sort of like status, it's a breaking of the emergence, it's a breaking of the status quo, because you cannot go back. And people say this time and time again, you cannot go back to pretending that Israel is this, you know, liberal democracy, apart from that small prison that they were just having beside the state. Let's not talk about the prison. Let's not talk about, you know, the occupation. Let's not talk about the displacement. Now you can't go back. There's a full-on genocide, and this is what's happening within the borders. The problem is, who's there to oppose it internally, and who's there to oppose it externally?
Thank you again, Moya Lothian-McLean, for joining us this evening. It's great to put the team back together.
Yeah, we're back, and this time in the passenger seat. It feels great.
Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.